In our last session, we looked at how Daniel's prophecy is very clearly rooted in history and how what we've seen has been fulfilled. And because that's been fulfilled, it can give us confidence and excitement to look at what lies ahead. We left off last time with 1/7 remaining, where Daniel writes about 77s, and we've had 69 of them. What about that final one? What we have here is something that gives us the ability to trust this prophecy of Daniel. And as we've said, Daniel is prophesying in a time where things have been fulfilled, but it also looks ahead. And what we've got is 7 sevens and 62 sevens, which by my counts give us 69 sevens. And in verse 24, God is talking about 70 sets of 7. So what we have are 69 sets of 7 that have been fulfilled and 1 set of 7 that hasn't. What's in effect happened is that what we read in verse 26 of this ruler, this anointed one, being killed and appearing to have accomplished nothing, it's like the button's been pushed on the pause button on the stopwatch. We've had 62 sevens after the 7 sevens. We've had 69 of our 77s. And there's now this gap with 1/7 remaining. What we begin to understand from this is what we would call the time of the Gentiles, or the time of the church, where between Jesus' death and the end of time, we see this pausing, and God's plan for Israel begins to get revealed. It's generally accepted that this final set of 7 relates to the 7 years of the tribulation that we read about in Revelation. And what we see is that this is focused on Jerusalem. Let's explain that a little bit further. In verse 26, we see that the anointed one will be killed, appearing to have accomplished nothing. But a ruler will arise whose armies will destroy the city and the temple. That happened in AD 70 when the Romans came and destroyed the temple of God. And so what we see prophesied in Daniel 9 happened at a real point in time in AD 70. And we see this stopwatch on pause, because it goes on to say that the end will come with a flood, and war and its miseries are decreed from that time to the very end. The ruler will make a treaty with the people for a period of 1 set of 7, but after half this time he'll put an end to the sacrifices and offerings, and as a climax to his terrible deeds he will set up a sacrilegious object that causes desecration until the fate decreed for this defiler is poured out on him. Daniel's clearly speaking of the Antichrist. But what we see is that this passage is talking about when Israel is going to be restored. And what we see in history is that for many years this wasn't possible, because after the temple was destroyed, Israel didn't exist. The nation of Israel, the temple, was destroyed until in 1948 the nation of Israel was reformed, and then in 1967 Israel was back in Jerusalem. All this time, this time clock, this stopwatch, is beginning to warm up again. It's beginning to get to that point of saying God's plans and purposes are beginning to come again. So what we see Daniel describing is how this Antichrist will come with disasters, wars, miseries, and that he'll make a peace treaty with Israel, but halfway through that he'll put an end to the sacrifices and the offerings and set something in the temple up as opposed to God. Look back to what we read in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Look back to what Jesus says in Matthew 24. What we begin to see, and as we begin to move into Revelation, is this picture of the Antichrist coming, opposing Israel, and much of this focus being rooted on what's happening in Israel. The power of the Word of God is amazing. Not only does God reveal his purposes, but he reveals something of the timescales involved. And for us as Christians, let's marvel afresh at the amazing power of the Word of God. But let it make us realise the truth of what God is telling us, that there is a time coming when the Antichrist will come in opposition to the people of God. Are we prepared to choose who we will serve?